Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And a question. Is there such a thing as a perfect Friday? I had donuts for a snack earlier. I have beer in the fridge, and Prit is here to talk about the Eastern Front. If that isn't a perfect Friday, I don't know what is. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Prit. How are you, my friend?
Good evening. What a lovely introduction. I'm very well. I hope you're well too.
I'm good, and we're rounding off at least the Eastern Front week with a chat to you. As I say, can't get better than that. So, I was going to say something about the battle, but I have so little understanding of this. I thought I'm going to get it all wrong, so I'm just going to basically hand it all over to you to take us through this one. And as always, the links to Prit's books are in the description below. There's too many to mention in the top of the show, but there's an outstanding catalogue of titles there for you to peruse and purchase. So, without further ado, we'll do the questions as we go along. Prit tends to keep an eye on what's going on in the sidebar, and there we are. Over to you, my friend.
Well, just to stop people searching too hard, my book that covers this particular battle will not be published probably until 26, I'm sorry to say. This one, guys, be patient. It will come.
They can do some catching up with the old ones, can't they? It's perfect. They can pace themselves out over the next year and a half.
Well, this is what happens when I retire from medicine. Instead of squeezing in the writing in little bits of spare time, now I do it all the time. So I've got ahead of my publisher in terms of books, so they have a bit of a queue. But anyway, we're going to talk about an almost forgotten episode of fighting on the Eastern Front around the city of Kielce and immediately to the west of that, which saw one of the last great escapes, if you like. The Germans had managed to, had to deal with several encirclements throughout the war. Of course, Stalingrad is the famous one, but there was one division I counted that by the end of the war, it had been encircled at least 4 times that I could find records for. So I imagine there was some unfortunate surviving veteran in the division. I have sort of all the other guys looking at him and saying, yeah, you're France the jinx, because every time you turn up, we get surrounded, But yes, there have been so many encirclements, and sometimes they got out, sometimes they didn't. So this is now right at the end of the war. We're into the last few months of the war. The Battle of the Bulge is pretty much burned out. The Allies are now clearing out the Reichswald and preparing to close up to the Rhine and getting ready to cross the Rhine. And in the east, having reached the Vistula River in September, August and September of 1944, the Red Army is now ready to go. I hope people can see this map on a decent scale. In short, we're looking really at modern-day Poland here, and all the units here are clustered along both sides of the Vistula River. At the moment, David, I'm not drinking anything, though I am looking forward to a nice glass of malt after dinner, so we shall see. The important thing regarding this map is that when the summer fighting of 1944 was done, the Red Army was left with 3 bridgeheads over the Vistula. There were 2 immediately south of Warsaw, which were in the sector covered by First Belarusian Front, and there was a much larger one to the south around the town of Sandomierz, which belonged to Koniev's First Ukrainian Front. And inevitably, this was where the offensives were going to be launched from in order to drive the Germans back to the line of the Oder-Neisse River. The German military had wanted to pull back to a shorter line. Inevitably, Hitler was having none of this. They had calculated that if they did so, they would be able to release sufficient divisions in order to establish operational reserves, and were confident that they could stop any major Soviet attack, but Hitler was having none of it. In fact, he then removed SS Viking and the rest of that particular SS Panzer Corps and sent it off to Hungary, leaving this front even weaker than it had been before. So if we jump on to the next slide, Woody. Here are the 3 people who are going to feature in today's presentation. The one on the left is General Nehring, Walter Nehring, who commanded 24th Panzer Corps. In the middle is Helmut Recknagel, who commanded 42nd Corps. And on the right is Dietrich von Saucken, who at this point was commander of the Großdeutschland Panzer Corps. He was actually up in East Prussia. And when the Soviet offensive began, he was ordered to move his corps to the Polish city that I'm reliably informed is pronounced Łódź. It's spelled L-O-D-Z, but the pronunciation of Polish is something that I find quite challenging. So if any of you know better than me, I apologize in advance for having got it wrong. Wearing a monocle was not considered particularly eccentric, particularly amongst the Prussian aristocracy. I will come to the monocle later, though, because it plays a part in the story of what happens to Saucken later on in the war. So two of these guys, Nehring and Recknagel, left and center, are on the map that we've just had a look at, and we'll see it again in a minute. And Saucken is on his way. His Panzer Corps consists of Großdeutschland and the Brandenburg Division, but by the time he gets the move order, it's too late for Großdeutschland to move. It's already committed to fighting in East Prussia, and instead he gets the absurdly named Parachute Panzer Division Hermann Goering as a replacement. And these guys are going to turn up once the fighting begins. Bagration, yes, I have a book coming on Bagration. It will be published next year, I am proud to say. I'm just discussing with my editor at the moment the precise title, and after much beating around the bush, we've pretty much decided on calling it Bagration. There's a bit of imagination for you, you know. Anyway, let's jump on to the next slide. So Konyev's First Ukrainian Front burst out of the Sandomierz bridgehead on the 12th of January. A fascinating little rabbit hole to dive down here. Soviet-era memoirs talk about how the operation was meant to start in the third week of January, but was brought forward at the request of Churchill because of the pressure that the Allies were under in the Ardennes in the Battle of the Bulge, which makes absolutely no sense whatever, because British involvement in that, of course, was modest. And if there was going to be a request for help, it wouldn't have come from Churchill. And also, by the 12th of January, that's pretty much done and dusted. There was no crisis. But Soviet historiography said, no, we brought forward our offensive to help out the Western Allies. And this was all part of the narrative of how the Soviets did absolutely everything they could, but the Western Allies never really lifted a finger to help poor old Soviet Union. The bombardment that preceded this attack was one of the most brutal that the Red Army put up. Now, the Soviet god of war is well known, the weight of their artillery barrages, but this one was exceptionally well targeted. They'd been sitting there since September. They knew exactly where all the positions were, and they absolutely hammered them. It was one of the very few occasions that when the Soviet troops attacked, they saw German infantry just running, that they had absolutely hammered them. So Konyev's front burst out of the bridgehead on the first day, on the 12th. He had two tank armies, both of which were unleashed on that first day. So in the south, he had 3rd Guards Tank Army. In the north, he had 4th Tank Army. And these were into battle on the first day. On previous operations, the tank armies had to loan their first echelon to the breakthrough troops because they got stuck in the German defenses. On this occasion, for the first time, they were able to be committed exactly as they were meant to be, fresh, full strength, fully fueled and armed and ready to go.
Just a quick question about the artillery, if I may, Prit.
Yeah.
We know that the Western Allies by the spring of 45 they've been using artillery for a long time, but they are conscious that the war is, that the final hurdle is in sight now, and there's a sort of sense of let's try and bring as many men back as we can, yes, and not do the kind of risky maneuvers we were doing earlier in the war. Are the Soviets thinking the same way, or are they just using it because they've got it, or both?
It's a very good question. I don't think anybody in the high command is particularly bothered about trying to keep as many men alive as possible. They wanted to get this over and done with as quickly as possible, not least because Stalin is still paranoid that the West is going to do a deal with Hitler. So he wants to get on with this and get to Berlin, get to seize the bits of territory that he has been promised as quickly as possible before the West changes its mind and backs out of what was agreed at the Tehran conference. And if that means another 15,000 dead in the Red Army, well, what the heck, who cares? You know, he's going to do it anyway. This assault gun, I believe, is an Su-85. The interesting thing in this picture is that those two riflemen, the two tank riders, are carrying German Sturmgewehrs. So these are presumably captured weapons. If we go in front of the next slide, this is a close-up of the Sandomierz bridgehead. And you can see that 48th Panzer Corps was the one that took the brunt of this massive onslaught. So 4 combined arms armies smashing into it. The 2 tank armies, both within the bridgehead at kickoff, and they're deployed in the second half of the day. 24th Panzer Corps was meant to be 4th Panzer Army's operational reserve. And in principle, it was quite a reserve. It consisted of 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, which were each 1 Panzer Grenadier Battalion light, but they had nearly a full complement of tanks. So that's not, you know, that's at this stage of the war, we're talking of quite a sizable force. He also had a Tiger Abteilung with no fewer than 52 Tigers, a mixture of Tiger 1s and King Tigers. So this is really quite a powerful force, except the Führer had ordered that it be deployed within about 12 kilometers of the front. Nehring and all the other senior officers wanted to hold it further back so it wouldn't get sucked into the fighting too soon. It wouldn't get caught in the initial artillery bombardments and the airstrikes, and it could intervene, you know, having had a decent look at how things were unfolding. Hitler was having none of it. And in fact, it suffered quite badly in the, not so much the initial bombardment, but when the Soviet artillery started shifting into deeper fire, and also Soviet aviation started hitting supply routes, command posts, lines of communication, all the signals traffic broke down. And for much of this battle, Nehring at the headquarters of 24th Panzer Corps is out of touch with 4th Panzer Army. 4th Panzer Army has no contact with practically anybody. And 48th Panzer Corps, which has been around a long time, this is one of the finest, you know, one of the finest records of any Panzer Corps. They've been in the thick of the fighting on the Eastern Front, but my goodness, it practically ceases to exist on that first day in the face of this massive artillery onslaught, and then these 4 armies smashing into it. So the first thing that happens is that finally a signal reaches Nehring saying you're to concentrate 24th Panzer Corps at Kielce, ready to strike into the northern flank of the Soviet forces that are pouring west out of this bridgehead. Nehring manages to get orders to 16th Panzer Division, which reaches Kielce quite quickly. 17th Panzer Division, a little bit further south, gets caught up heavily in air attacks, artillery fire. Some of the leading elements of Lelyushenko's 4th Guards tank army smash into the Tiger Abteilung. They catch several of the Tigers refueling and succeed in knocking them out. So by the end of the 12th of January, the first phase of what the Soviets referred to as the Vistula Oder operation has got off to an absolutely flying start. The Red Army is streaming west, and there is practically nothing in its path. Terry, the grey areas, this is an enlargement of the previous map, which had the key. Grey areas are woodland. There are some elevations here, but I haven't marked them on here because they're not particularly significant. The woodland would play a much bigger role, as would the rivers in the fighting.
And just a quick question from me, if I may, Prit.
Yeah.
Just to tie it in with Bastian's show about Königsberg yesterday, which I understand is a little bit later in January. But at this point, yes, the German supply lines are considerably less than they'd been, you know, a year or so earlier. But have they got enough, you know, fuel and basic essentials for both areas, and indeed the other areas they're fighting, or are they having to, you know, favour certain sectors?
Yeah, we're going to go. The fuel is going to be a major consideration here, because a tank without fuel is just a bunker, really. Its whole merit and virtue lies in being able to move and do stuff. In my days, in the last phase of the Cold War, as a serviceman, the joke in the British Army was the Chieftain is undoubtedly the best tank in NATO, provided it breaks down in the right place, because they were so unreliable and the engines broke down all the time. So yeah, mobility is everything, and fuel is critical. And of course, Germany has practically no fuel left here. This is one of the reasons, actually, why Hitler is so determined to hold on to Budapest and to as much of Hungary as possible, because it's one of the few sources of crude oil. The rest of gasoline production is coming out from the synthetic factories, which are producing fuel at a reasonable rate given their limitations. But a Panzer division like 16th Panzer starts this battle with 210 tanks. They're going to chew through an awful lot of fuel very quickly. We have so 12th of January sees this breakout. On the 13th of January, Lelyushenko's tank army runs slap bang into the Tiger Abteilung and 17th Panzer Division, which are still attempting to move north to link up with the rest of 24th Panzer Corps in Kielce. In the process, Colonel Brooks, who is the commander of 17th Panzer Division, is taken prisoner when his headquarters is overrun. Most of his division is scattered. The Tiger Abteilung, it's described in Nehring's memoirs as being pretty much annihilated on days 1 and 2. But according to Soviet accounts, it was still fighting and still causing considerable trouble, several days later. So I suspect as a formed body of 52 Tigers, but that was now history. But these Tigers kept turning up, and as Tigers will, they were formidable vehicles, and particularly at medium range, where the 85mm guns on the newer T-34s were going to struggle to knock them out. They would dispatch the Soviet armor with ease. So that this was they were going to be quite a nuisance, at least for the Red Army. On the 14th of January, by then resistance has pretty much ended to this breakout. Those 4 combined arms armies are just fanning out across Poland, and behind them, oh wow, fantastic! Yes, so Jedi, can you help us here? How would you pronounce that? Is it Stashov? If you could just say yes or no or whatever, that would be really helpful. Yeah, so on the so we've done the 12th and 13th. On the 14th, the Red Army is just advancing into open space. The remnants of 17th Panzer and the Tiger Abteilung managed to reach Kielce and link up with 16th Panzer. Nehring is under orders to stay where he is, as is Recknagel with 42 Corps further to his east. And both of them are thinking, are you absolutely mad? You have these forces that have completely bypassed our southern flank. On the 14th, Zhukov's first Belarusian front bursts out of the 2 bridgeheads south of Warsaw, so they're closing in from the north. And these guys are trapped in an eastward projecting salient. Even though they haven't been given permission to withdraw, Recknagel now makes the usual sort of fudge of saying, well, all non-essential rear area elements can now start pulling out towards the west. Aware that the whole of 42 Corps is still holding out on the northern edge of the old bridgehead, Nehring is reluctant to pull out of Kielce, but he knows that he can't really hang around there very long, because he has limited fuel. One flank is already bypassed, the other flank is about to be bypassed, and moreover, he's completely out of contact with everybody. He has, he has no idea what's happening. So let's jump on to the next slide. Terry's question about Joseph Stalin too is they had some heavy tank regiments in this breakout, and of course they could deal with pretty much anything they met. It's worth pointing out that actually the 85mm gun on a T-34 could kill a Tiger without too much difficulty, certainly against side armor. And of course, it doesn't really matter what the tank is. If you blow its tracks off, it's not going anywhere. And by now, the Soviet gunners were well aware of this and were perfectly capable of disabling tanks, and leaving them for other units to knock out. So here you can see just how rapidly the Red Army burst out of this bridgehead. And you think of some of the painful advances in the past where they had to hammer away. But here you are, by the end of the 13th, they're about 40 miles deep into Poland and just rolling along unstoppable. By now, most of Nehring's corps has concentrated around Kielce. He's been joined by 20th Panzer Grenadier Division 2. There is this river, I think it's called the Czarna Nida. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. And the Red Army is basically on the south side of that, with the Germans on the north side. And what you can't see on this map is further north, Zhukov is also now advancing to the west. So these guys are trapped in this salient. On the 15th of January, the Red Army captures Kielce after fairly heavy fighting. And they actually sweep into it from the east, with Nehring's troops being driven out of the southern part of the city. So he is now pinned between Kielce and that river immediately to the south. There's only a weak rifle corps that is left in Kielce by the end of the day. They've taken quite heavy losses, but the really any armored reserves west of the Police, nope, there is absolutely nothing west of the Police River. The only armored reserves were 24th Panzer Corps, which Hitler has insisted on holding right up in the front line. There would have been an SS Panzer Corps, but that's disappeared off to Hungary. So there is absolutely nothing here, and it's in this. It's at this moment that the Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps is on its way south to try to remedy this. Kara's question about why did they not knock out the Sandomierz bridgehead? They tried really, really hard in September 1944. And if you read the very self-serving memoirs of Hermann Balck, he describes how he led 48th Panzer Corps in its attacks to break up this bridgehead. And we succeeded to a degree, but we couldn't finish the job. And you're left thinking, you made a dent in it, and that's about it. By now, the Red Army is actually pretty good at stopping panzer divisions in their path. They had made a really skillful use of anti-tank guns in pack fronts. They would rapidly lay minefields to focus tanks into the fire of the guns, so they could stop panzer attacks really quite effectively. So it wasn't through lack of effort. The Germans had tried quite hard, but they lacked the air power to do much about the bridgehead. They lacked the artillery ammunition to do much about it. So once it was established, it was, there was not much they could do. Terry's question of what are the Germans hoping to achieve? Well, it's a damn good question, and there are several answers to this. There is a group of Germans, politicians and military alike, who are, if you like, the diehards. They know that there's not, they're not going to come out of any peace well. They're probably going to be charged with war crimes or whatever, and they're just fighting on to the bitter end. By now, in late 1944, there had been a Soviet penetration into East Prussia, which resulted in the infamous so-called Nemmersdorf massacre, which was to an extent exaggerated by the Germans, but nevertheless took place. So the Germans are well aware that the Red Army is going to commit mass atrocities when it gets into German territory. That's another reason to fight on. And although some senior commanders have been briefed that the Germans know the Western powers have already allocated everything east of the Elbe to the Soviet occupation zone, there is still hope that if we can hold the Red Army at arm's length, well, that might change. Or at the very least, the Americans and British and Canadians may get into Germany and even to Berlin first, and then hand it over to the Russians, which is better than the Red Army fighting its way in there. And so there are various factors. And also, what can you do? So for example, if Nehring had decided, stuff it, we're just going to surrender, he's basically condemning the units on either side of him to death,
yeah.
which is really, really difficult. So there's no way of a coordinated surrender or whatever. The failed July plot has left everybody under very, very close scrutiny. So there's no sort of organized resistance or anything. There's really nothing they can do other than fight on to the bitter end.
I mean, they've made their bed, haven't they? I mean, that's it. It's all
Absolutely.
every problem they're facing is of their own making. So,
Yes.
oh dear, how
Yes.
sad. Never mind. You know, I
Yeah.
don't,
I
I
mean,
don't have any sympathy.
yeah, it is terrible, and I feel very sorry for the people who are going to die senselessly. But you could make a very good case for saying that's war. That's what wars do. They just kill people senselessly.
Yeah, and I just want to put in mind, folks, if they didn't see the show with Bastian yesterday, he talked a lot about the psychology of the German soldier and how they didn't necessarily think that they're moving from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. They're taking a lot of the mindset from further east as they fall back, and he did some fantastic work into understanding and looking at why they are still fighting. And so if you haven't checked that one out, go and watch that one. It was ostensibly about Königsberg, but his study into the mindset of the German soldiers was what made it a standout episode, in my humble opinion.
So with Kielce now in Soviet hands, on the 16th of January, Nehring decides to take the city back because all of his troops are to the south of it. So with what's left of 17th Panzer Division, backed by the few surviving Tigers, but mainly using 20th Panzer Grenadier and 16th Panzer Division, he storms back into the city, throws the two weak Soviet rifle divisions out of it, and recaptures it. Immediately, the Red Army directs other units to the area, but he has no intention of holding this any longer than he absolutely has to. And even by nightfall, he's already evacuating towards the northwest. All the time, he's sending signals to Recknagel to his east, saying, this is your last chance. You have got to get out now, because otherwise we're going to be we are absolutely doomed. And Recknagel is doing his very best. He's extracting his infantry. And remember, German infantry are infantry. They lack transport, and what transport they have, they don't have fuel for. So even pulling out that relatively short distance of 30, 40 miles to Kielce in winter through heavy snow under constant attack is a really tough ask. Nevertheless, he's determined to get his men out if he possibly can. Were troops of both sides treated equally if needing medical attention? Well, Gary, no, they weren't. First, whatever you may hear, I am not aware of any medical service in the entire Second World War that treated wounded prisoners with impartiality. They would always treat their own men first. That's human nature. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just how it is. It's also worth pointing out that although the Red Army is going to take a lot of prisoners during this, actually neither side is particularly keen on taking prisoners, and they're just executing people out of hand. And if they're wounded, well, they're not even worth taking as forced laborers. So if you're wounded and you get captured, your chances of survival on both sides are pretty poor. So a little bit of an aside here, because this really matters. One of the problems that the Red Army had faced at Stalingrad and after was, what do you do when you surround people? Now, one of the problems at Stalingrad was that pretty much half of the entire Red Army's assets were tied down in the ring around 6th Army, which meant that only half of the assets were available to push the German lines away to the west. And that half still did a pretty good job, but you can imagine if you think of how close the German line came to collapsing, if it hadn't been for 6th Army tying down half the Red Army in that encirclement, the German line could have collapsed completely. At the Battle of Cherkassy, they tried to address this, and they moved stuff around so that when the encirclement of the German 11th Army took place, they directed the 8th Army took place, they directed the tank armies to turn outwards and push the German lines away to the west, while the cavalry corps was directed to turn into the rear of the pocket and break it up. But the cavalry corps proved to be too weak to do so, and the Germans were able to scramble a line into place. So when it comes to the Vistula-Oder operation, they've come up with a new cunning plan. And the plan is quite simple, that when we break out, the tank armies are simply going to head west. And we're going to leave any bypass troops to the second echelon. They can deal with them. So by now, by the time that 24th Panzer Corps has recaptured Kielce and then is abandoning it while still holding out a tenuous link to 42nd Corps to its east, most of the Soviet armor has pushed on, and they're actually operating, as luck would have it, on the seam between Konyev's front down here in the south and Zhukov's front to the north. So they're operating in this little vacuum with armies streaming past both their flanks, and they're in this little gap. So having retaken Kielce and then given it up on the 16th, the next stage is to start the withdrawal. So led by his surviving armor, Nehring sets off towards the northwest, thinking, well, that's the direction of the city of Łódź. He has learned that the Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps has been ordered to Łódź, so he's thinking, if I can get within range of that, they may be able to fight their way through to me and we'll be able to get out of here. As they start the withdrawal, this column is strung out over about 50 or 60 miles between his leading tanks and the last remnants of 42nd Corps pulling out from the east. He's only in radio contact intermittently with Recknagel in his headquarters. Recknagel informs him that he's going to take command of the rear guard and try to protect the rear of the column, whilst Nehring takes control of the leading elements to try to find an escape route. They have a stroke of very good fortune where, as they move through some of these forests in this area, they come across a fuel dump and they're able to top off all the tanks of their surviving vehicles. And they calculate that actually with this refueling, they have enough to get back to the Oder River, provided they can get that far. But central Poland, whilst it's not very hilly, does have quite a few major rivers running across it, and the bridges are going to be a key here. Marks and Sparks 1, how does Nehring rank regarding the generals? He was, I think, one of the less well-rated generals, but he was a quietly competent figure. He was in North Africa. In fact, he was subordinate to Rommel in North Africa for a while. He was then wounded, or I think became unwell, and was evacuated before the collapse in North Africa. He suffered no fewer than 5 wounds during the war, requiring hospitalization, and he also suffered from other ill health, with the result that he was often relieved of command, and then he'd go back to take command of 24th Panzer Corps or 4th Panzer Army, and then he'd be off sick again, and then he'd go back. He was not involved in any really heroic victories, nor was he involved in any disastrous defeats. He was a very competent, unflashy general, if you like. And, you know, his memoirs are very interesting because he doesn't really attempt any self-glorification like Hermann Balck or any of these others. He just tells it how he saw it. He gets some things wrong, some of the dates are wrong, but, you know, it's very difficult when you're writing from, you know, from memory after all of those years. Well, I think we'll forgive him for that, for those small slips. Meanwhile, Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps arrives in Łódź on the 18th of January, at the same time that Zhukov's forces advancing past Warsaw are rapidly approaching from the east. He realizes that this position is hopeless and that he has absolutely no chance of holding on to this. So he manages to make radio contact with Nehring and says, you know, I will attempt to hold the bridges open for you, but in the end, it's going to be up to you to reach them. I really don't have anything that can reach you. By now, the Luftwaffe has turned up with a few transports and has dropped supplies, but inevitably a lot of those supplies fall behind Soviet lines, and much to the irritation of the German army units involved in this, they complain bitterly that the Hermann Goering division seems to be getting the lion's share of air supply, but they're just, you know, who knows how that worked out, whether that was deliberate or accidental or otherwise. Can we jump on to the next slide? So here we have one of the dead tigers. I always think of the gentleman in the hat in front of it, describing to his mates how he single-handedly dealt with it with his walking stick. Who knows? But by now there was practically, yeah, I know, I had to have a dig at Balk. Yeah, you're quite right, Paolo. It would not be right if I didn't. But you know, so many people regard him as this sort of peerless commander, and actually when you read the accounts left by some of his subordinates, they're rather less flattering about him. So can we move on to the next slide? Yeah. Okay, so here we are now. This is the abandonment of Kielce, and you can see that the Red Army has now just motored on. The Varta River has been reached. The Germans, the two isolated corps, are in this salient with these forces streaming past their southern flank. Krakow is about to be abandoned, and equally bad to the north of this map, we have Zhukov's front sweeping past the exposed flank, the northern flank of these two corps, and they have absolutely nothing they can send in its path. Saucken's first division into the field was the Brandenburg division, and it suffered quite heavy losses almost immediately as it ran into the two tank armies that Zhukov had unleashed. Yet he still managed to hold on to crossings over the Police River in preparation for these retreating Germans, provided they can get there. So everything now depends on them not being spotted. Having said that, even if they are spotted, because of this new Soviet plan of we're just bypassing isolated units and we're pressing on into the depths of Poland, even if they are spotted, it's not as if there's much that the Soviets can immediately direct to intercept and destroy these units. Can we move on to the next slide?
Yeah.
Here we are. This is a picture of the wreckage left by 16th Panzer Division as it pulled out. I imagine that Panther looks pretty intact to me. Everything's pointing in the right direction of its line of march, judging by the truck. I suspect it's either broken down or more likely just out of fuel. And so this long column is just leaving this trail of abandoned vehicles, abandoned guns behind it. But the soldiers are pressing on. And the commander of 20th Panzer Grenadier Division later said that, you know, during one of the strange things of this was at no stage did we think we weren't going to get out. All the time we believed that we would get out, provided we just kept going and, you know, didn't make a mess of things. Yeah, there are interesting parallels here with Falaise, aren't there? Except I suspect that Western air power was actually much more effective than Soviet aviation.
I was just going to ask you, Prit, I mean, on a kind of scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being kind of a disorganized kind of fallback and 10 being highly organized, how efficiently are the Germans managing this? I mean, are they able to kind of put fuel from vehicles that are running out into one to keep them going, or is it chaos?
It's a little bit of both. There are some units that are keeping very good order, particularly the 16th and what's left of 17th Panzer Division, 20th Panzer Grenadier Division. They're keeping very tidy order. Some of the infantry divisions that are holding up, that are, you know, forming the long body of the column and forming the rear guard holding off the Red Army, some of those are fighting well and very efficiently. Generally, by this stage of the war, you tend to find that you'll get some energetic and charismatic leaders who are able to hold together battle group size units and get them to function very well. Other units with perhaps leaders who are not familiar to their men, or who are just not particularly skilled officers, those are the units that start to disintegrate. There are some problems though. For example, at one point, a rumor goes around that soldiers from one division have siphoned fuel off the trucks of another division in order to refuel their vehicles. When Nehring hears about this, he orders the battalion commander of that unit to be relieved of his command. And when word of this reaches the battalion, all of the other ranks of the battalion refuse to move until their battalion commander is restored, which he duly was. The efficacy of Soviet air power was actually not as great as that of the Western ground attack planes. You hear about the Sturmovix and their tremendous firepower and their lethality. Take it all with a pinch of salt. Having said that, I read recently that in field tests, by planting a Panther tank in the middle of a field and getting Typhoons to attack it, the chances of hitting it with a salvo of rockets, hitting it with just one rocket, was about 4%. So I think sometimes the efficacy of Western air power, particularly tactical air, is sometimes exaggerated. But interestingly, I'm just back from
sometimes doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Every report I've read of Normandy is that artillery was way more efficient than the air power. Although Typhoons and Mustangs and whipping in always makes them for nice paintings. But even just to interrupt, even the RAF survey of Mortam, where they were trying to make their own efficiency look good, they came out saying, yeah, about 4% of the vehicles were knocked out by air power. So yeah, it's
anyway. But interestingly, I'm just back from a recce for a tour later on this year of Estonia, and we were discussing the use of air in the Narva sector in Estonia, and a Danish colonel who was with us he made, I think, a very interesting point. He said, the thing about air power is not necessarily how accurate it is and how, efficiently it kills tanks or whatever. He said, it's the fact that it just appears out of nowhere. So the psychological impact of operating under hostile skies, he said, should not be forgotten, that this can be utterly demoralizing for the troops on the ground when the planes just suddenly plunge down, and even if they don't do much damage, everyone dives into the hedgerows, everyone tries to take cover. It just disrupts stuff, even if casualties.
You rarely read the German accounts describing the fear of artillery, but the Yabos, that's on their mind every day, isn't it?
Exactly. Artillery, you know it's coming. They've been firing ranging shots for a while. You've been digging in, etc. Planes can get you anywhere. They can get you on the line of march. They can get you in the front line, and it's that. I think it's the terror engendered by that uncertainty that plays a big part on this. Anyway, let's carry on. This is a bit of a complicated map, but this shows you, if you look at the dotted lines here, just look at the first dotted line on the right-hand edge of the map, and you can see by now Łódź has fallen. Großdeutschland is falling back as slowly as it can towards the west. And there is this town of Piotrków right at the right-hand end of the map, at this enormous salient where the Germans find themselves. This town became a key position because as the German divisions pulled through it, they would hand it over to the one that was following, and that town had to be held, because by now the Red Army is getting its act together. Although most of the forces have swept on to the west, the second echelon, particularly from the north, is pressing down against this salient. Slightly belatedly, the Soviets have realized there's actually a large German force operating here, and they're determined to destroy it. But they're struggling to concentrate sufficient force, and an enormous battle breaks out around Piotrków. Recknagel, who is in command of the rearguard, is killed there on the 23rd of January, not by the Soviets, but by a Polish partisan sniper. The command of the rearguard in that town goes through two further officers, one of whom is wounded. The third commander is then killed. But they managed to hold the town open long enough for other units to squeeze through and trail away to the west. Meanwhile, the leading elements of 16th Panzer Army have crossed the town, that little town you can see called Buchek, in the middle of the salient on the right-hand edge of the map. Their 16th Panzer Division finally links up with an armored reconnaissance battalion from Saucken's corps. And the bad news is they learn that actually most of the Großdeutschland Corps is now also in danger of being cut off, but Saucken has risked the destruction of his two divisions in order to hold open the crossings over the Warta River for Nehring and for Recknagel's men. And this exhausted column streams across the river at Sirac and continues this painful retreat towards the west. So this is the great escape, if you like. This is the extraction of these forces. The Germans suffered very, very heavy casualties in the fighting at Piotrków in particular. They left about 30,000 dead or missing there. I think 4 infantry divisions and a Panzer Grenadier division effectively ceased to exist during this retreat. But nonetheless, 16th and what was left of 17th Panzer, 20th Panzer Grenadier, and about 3 other infantry divisions made it out intact, as did Nehring. As they reached the Oder River, which you can see roughly where the front line is on the west here, you can see that by now the Red Army had seized a bridgehead over the Oder at the town of Steinau. It's in the sort of about a quarter of the way in from the left of the map. And as Nehring's corps was extracted and allowed to retreat beyond the Oder, Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps was ordered to remain on the east of the Oder and strike south into the northern flank of this Soviet salient. Saucken did the best he could, but his forces were soon boxed in and driven back, and eventually he was forced to evacuate back across the river via a pontoon bridge that he had ordered his men to establish just in case. So Nehring is going to stay with 24th Panzer Corps through to the end of the war. Someone mentioned he was involved in an important counterattack further south at Lauban a little bit later in the war, just a couple of weeks in the future. Nehring was ordered to throw Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps into yet another counterattack, this time to the west of the Oder, in order to try to break up that bridgehead around Steinau. The attack was heavily outnumbered by the Red Army forces in its path and was very rapidly smashed. The leading units found themselves surrounded and isolated, and in confused fighting, Saucken drove through the Soviet forces in his Kubelwagen to link up with the encircled men, and then proceeded to lead them out personally. By now, Army Group Center was under the command of Ferdinand Schörnow, Hitler's favorite field marshal, or by now he was his favorite field marshal, Model having fallen out of favor. Saucken was summoned to the headquarters of the Army Group and was sent in to see Schörnow. Nobody knows what was said. The other officers who were there said they could hear raised voices beyond the door. And when Saucken emerged, he was apparently white-faced with anger, having just been dismissed as commander of Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps for the 2 failed counterattacks to eliminate the Soviet bridgehead. He was not idle for very long. He returned to Berlin, and very shortly after, Hitler summoned him to his presence. So I remember the question earlier on about the monocle. This becomes important because it was customary when you addressed a senior officer to remove your monocle. This was an old Prussian thing, I believe. Anyway, Saucken turned up at the Führer bunker. He had been summoned to the presence, and he walked in. He didn't even hand over his dress sword to the guards outside the Führer bunker, where he was meant to leave all weapons outside. And he walked into the conference room with his monocle firmly in place, dressed immaculately, and was told by Hitler that he was to proceed immediately to what is now Gdansk, was then Danzig, to take command of what was left of the German forces in East and West Prussia. And as he departed, Hitler's parting words were, "And you will place yourself under the command of Gauleiter Forster," who was the Nazi Party Gauleiter of Danzig and West Prussia. Saucken turned to face the Führer with his monocle in place and just said to him, "I will not be answerable to any Gauleiter." All of the other officers who were present waited for the inevitable eruption and explosion of anger, not least because Saucken had not even used the traditional Mein Führer.
Mm.
After a brief stare, Hitler was the one who looked away and said, very well, Saucken, do as you see best. Saucken then made a point of saluting Hitler with a formal military salute, not with the Hitler salute, which was now compulsory, turned on his heel and left. He flew out to the Gulf of Danzig, where his headquarters was in a little peninsula to the north of what is now Gdansk. And at the time, there was a naval base at a town known to the Germans as Hella. In Polish, it's now Hel, on a very narrow peninsula stretching out into the bay. And he oversaw the last defense of this region from the attacks of the Red Army. As the war came to a close, the troops who were defending this little enclave around the Vistula estuary and around Hella, rumors began to spread amongst the troops that they were going to be forced to surrender to the Red Army. Ships had been picking up civilians and wounded for several weeks and taking them off to the west. And hundreds of soldiers streamed into the port in Hella in the hope of finding a ship to take them west. Nehring drove out to the troops and stood up in the back of his Kubelwagen and addressed them personally. He confirmed that the following day they were all going to go into captivity. He also confirmed that there were no more ships coming and that there was no way out. And he finished by saying, throughout the war, soldiers under my command have always served with great professionalism and great loyalty and great discipline. And I am confident that you will do so to the very end. And without a word, the soldiers turned and returned to their positions to stay loyal to the man that they regarded as their commander. By now, Hitler was dead, and Dönitz was the head of the German government. He dispatched a plane to Hella to collect Saucken and fly him out to the west. In a gesture that would have come as no surprise to anybody, Saucken sent the plane back full of wounded soldiers and chose to go into captivity. Remember, this is about the same time that Field Marshal Schörner, Hitler's great favorite, stripped himself of his uniform and, dressed in civilian clothing, attempted to escape to the west so that he could surrender to the Americans. Saucken's last act as commander of AOK Ostpreußen was to negotiate with Wasilewski that when his men surrendered, they would be able to take their trucks with them. And he had those trucks loaded up with whatever food and water that they had available, so that at least there would be some supplies for the prisoner columns as they headed off to the east. And as men grew tired, they were loaded into the vehicles too until they ran out of fuel. Saucken would remain in captivity until 1955. He was badly mistreated by the Soviets. Yeah, Andreas, he was flown out of Courland, but he was flown out of Courland to take command of Army Group Center. So that was, if you like, a reassignment rather than avoiding surrender to the Red Army. Saucken was eventually released in 1955. He acted as an advisor briefly to the new Bundeswehr before retiring and spending the last of his days indulging a long-standing hobby as a landscape painter. Nehring succeeded in surrendering to the Americans, and he was one of the generals who spent 3 years in American captivity working with the US Historical Division, writing up various accounts of the German version of the history of the Second World War. He wrote extensively after the war, and despite his 5 serious wounds and his sickness, etc., he survived to the ripe old age of 90 and died in 1983. So that is the end of my talk about this almost forgotten episode. I think it's an epic tale and probably deserves to be better known. And I hope people have found it interesting.
Well, that goes without saying. I mean, of course they did. We'll do a couple of questions before you go and have your dinner. Peter O'Connell asked, given the Western Allies' advance eastwards that by February 45, even the Oder had little to offer as a line of resistance, what were the Germans thinking? I think you've answered that already, but they aren't thinking. They've got,
Yeah. They're very much they're thinking of, every day that we prevent the Red Army reaching German cities, it's another day that German civilians don't have to endure Soviet occupation. And who knows, the Americans and the British may cross the Elbe and provide protection for more Germans. And this becomes a really big this becomes a really big factor in the manner in which Heinrich then fights the Battle of the Seelow Heights, because his whole attitude in that final battle prior to the Red Army reaching Berlin is that if we can actually stop the Red Army dead, then by the time they've regrouped and they're able to come again, who knows, something might have changed and the Americans will then, perhaps come to our aid. How good is I think there's a question there about how good were Soviet deep operation tactics. It's very hard to divorce the improved performance of the Red Army in 1944-45 from the deteriorating performance of the Wehrmacht. And the two go hand in hand. So how much of the success was because the Red Army was getting better? How much of it was because the Germans were getting worse? And how much of it is inevitably a blend of the two? I think there are several factors involved there.
One or two more. Stephen is asking: are photos hard to come of the battle or area, because the Russians took lots of post-battle? But in my research, trying to make a graphic for the show, there aren't many. I found
no. About this time next year will be when Osprey will start discussing what photos are going to go into the book, and the Gemma, who does most of this, is the queen of finding photos in archives, etc. And she's the lass who will find any photos. So perhaps in a year's time I can tell you what photos there are going to be in the book. It is curious though, searching on Google Images or whatever, you search for things like Battle of Berlin, Battle of the Bulge, whatever, you find tons and tons and tons of photos. For the Vistula Oder operation, there are remarkably few.
Well, like AI, they're popularity based Google. I mean, it's not. They may not be there. They may be there somewhere, but they come down low in the listings because of the way, as I understand it, Google works.
I've scrolled down through pages and pages of Google Images without finding anything. Yeah.
How many times on this channel have we said it's the same battles, the same campaigns that get discussed, and there are these other amazing ones. And all my mind was thinking about when you're talking is that this is happening at the same time as Budapest. It's happening as Königsberg. The Americans are starting to kind of push out after the Ardennes. I mean, I have no sympathy for the Germans. They've got themselves in this position, but all of this is happening at the same time, and yet we seem as historians or people interested in history to kind of focus on certain aspects of it, which is there. But we'll leave it at that, because you've got things to do and I've got things to do. So folks, we're talking about Stalin and Churchill's complicated relationship with Geoffrey Roberts tomorrow, and then next week it's all about pre-D-Day and the build up to Normandy. So thank everybody for your fantastic questions, and thank you, Prit, for being amazing, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers everybody. Thanks. Bye.